Join us now, ladies and gentlemen.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Tokyo on Fire Inside Baseball. In today's episode of Inside Baseball, I'm privileged to welcome Dr. James Brown, the foremost authority on Japan-Russian relations in Tokyo. Welcome back.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I think it's my third time.
Yes, well, you're doing so great. We get great comments every time you come on the show, so thank you very much.
Pleasure.
President Vladimir Putin is feeling his oats. He's the fourth-term president of the Russian Federation.
Well, that's right, and that has a big impact on relations between Japan and Russia. We have a situation now where Putin has been safely re-elected to his next 6-year term as president. No great surprise there. And also Abe has been fairly recently re-elected as well. And this is a point that Prime Minister Abe has made himself, that now that these two leaders have potentially a significant amount of time together, right, in the leadership of their respective countries, perhaps it's an opportunity for them to actually deal with some of the remaining long-term issues that have plagued this relationship.
Right. The dynamics are not really very good, are they? They're meeting in 5 days in St. Petersburg at an economic summit. They have time together. There's a lot going on there, but they will have a scheduled time to talk about the relationship and about how they're going to move forward. Isn't that right?
Well, there are actually two parts to the visit. You're right. First of all, Prime Minister Abe is going to St. Petersburg for the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. The focus there will be on economic issues, and so the thing to look for there is whether they have some significant economic deals that they're going to be able to announce. But then a bigger thing for Japan-Russia relations is actually the next day. Then the focus shifts to Moscow, where they're going to be having the celebration, the official opening of the year of Japan-Russia. And along with that, in Moscow, there will also be summit talks between the two leaders, and that's where we might see some potential announcements related to issues on the disputed islands and, the attempt to make some progress towards a peace treaty.
Right. So just to recap for viewers who don't know this, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, and after that, immediately after that, the Soviet Union invaded the northern territories in preparation for approaching Hokkaido and the main islands, and the United States put a stop to that, but those islands were never given up, and that's what the controversy is about, right?
Yeah, that's essentially right. So it's worth remembering that during the Second World War, the Soviet Union and Japan were not at war for most of it.
You're right. The Soviet Union was reluctant in approaching Japan, and they had a treaty of friendship.
Well, they had a neutrality pact which was signed in April 1941.
We're friends.
And that meant that, well, they weren't exactly friends. It was clearly an agreement which suited their geopolitical interests at the time. Now, the Soviet Union wanted to concentrate on the situation in Europe. It didn't want its Far East to be attacked by Japan.
They were glad when the Germans were attacking that the Japanese were quiet.
Well, exactly. And from the Japanese perspective, also, they wanted to make sure that their northern frontier would be quiet.
We can focus on the Americans coming in from the Philippines and Okinawa.
And you have to keep in mind also that in 1941, Soviet Union and Japan were effectively, well, they had a land border together, because Japan, of course, at that time was in Manchuria, bordering directly on the Soviet Far East. So they had that agreement, but then when it came to 1945, what took place was there was an agreement, a secret agreement made at Yalta between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, which was that the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan after the end of the conflict in Europe. And so the Soviet Union stuck with that agreement, and
you betcha.
They kept, it was a sort of last minute thing. It was supposed to be within 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, and they did it pretty much to the day.
Right.
And then they attacked Japanese positions in Manchuria, down into Korea, in Sakhalin, and then later on, they moved down the Kuril chain, and eventually they occupied the now disputed islands. One of the things which is particularly sensitive for the Japanese side is, well, firstly, that this Soviet attack came when Japan was more or less already defeated, the Japanese side says. And then added to that, the actual occupation of these islands was only completed at the beginning of September. So that's long after the 15th of August, when Japan announced its intention to accept the Potsdam Declaration.
A little bit of dirty pool. Really didn't sit well with MacArthur, did it?
Well, I mean, the Japanese side say that this was an underhand step, it was a stab in the back, but from the Soviet perspective and the narrative you still hear from the Russian side, which was, no, this was a commitment which we had to our allies, to the United States, to Britain, and we stuck with our agreement.
Right.
The Soviet Union was the victor of the Second World War, Japan was the loser, and so again, from Moscow's point of view, Japan should expect to have lost some territory.
Right. I understand that General MacArthur threatened the Soviet Union by saying, you know, those 2 bombs we have, that's not all we have. If you approach Hokkaido, you'll see what we've got in store.
Well, this is the thing which is enormously kind of debated about what the reasonings were behind Truman's decision to use the nuclear weapons, to what extent it was to end the war quickly, to what extent it was a message to the Soviet Union, and academics spend their lifetimes looking at this issue, and I don't think we can really get to the bottom of it, but certainly it's worth recognizing that there are arguments on both sides, and certainly many people believe that particularly the second bomb was really a message to the Soviet Union, back off, we have potentially more of these weapons.
Well, weren't they primed to invade Hokkaido?
Well, the Soviet side, after the end of the war, asked for an occupation zone in Hokkaido, which would have been around half of the island, and the US said no.
Just to divvy it up, just like we're going to do with Germany.
Well, exactly. So in some ways, you could make the case that Japan was really quite lucky in that they could have ended up not just with losing these 4 islands, which Japan says are part of their inherent territory, but also you could have had the division of Hokkaido, like Germany, like Korea.
Right. So let's get to the issue that's on stage right now. The Prime Minister will meet with the President of the Russian Federation in 5 days.
Yes, so it's going to be their 21st meeting. And Prime Minister Abe has put an enormous amount of effort into this relationship. It's been something that he always seems to have had a great interest in. And in 2016, in May, he announced what was described as a new approach to Russia.
That was about a year ago, right?
May 2016, so it's now 2 years.
Okay.
And that is his real kind of big push to try and make some progress in fully normalizing this relationship. Now, it's worth saying that the 2 sides are not officially at war. Although they don't have a peace treaty, in 1956 they signed a joint declaration which put an end to the state of war, but it didn't actually settle finally the issue and have a peace treaty, and that's because of the island dispute. So what Abe would dearly like to do is to sign that document, but that means overcoming the territorial issue.
Right.
And so that's where this new approach comes in. And what it consists of is a softening of Japan's initial demands over the islands. Ultimately, Abe still wants to get all 4 back, but he recognizes that Japan has been pushing for that for decades and has got nowhere.
Right.
So instead, I think quite sensibly, he's reduced his initial demand. Let's try and get some sort of progress, and who knows where it might lead. But for that, there need to be some incentives for the Russian side.
Right.
And those incentives are economic. So along with that new approach, which includes lots of political dialogue between the 2 leaders, there is also the 8-point economic cooperation plan. And that's what the focus will be on when the 2 sides meet in St. Petersburg.
Okay. It seems to me that the Prime Minister is looking for any good news, anything he can hang his hat on and say, see, I brought home the bacon to the Japanese population. He needs to really do well. And in foreign policy areas, usually that's where a leader gets, some pretty good traction. So I think he'll probably come home with some good news, but he's not really asking for a lot. And whatever he gets, it will involve a relinquishment of Japan's claim for those 4 islands. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I think we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves there. So let's look in detail at what's going to happen, taking advantage of the fact this is inside baseball. So I mentioned that he's reduced his demand. So what is he actually looking for? Well, it's to do with joint economic activities on the islands.
We're going to give you money.
Well, that would certainly be part of it, but we're talking about really quite small-scale projects here. The initial agreement to talk about joint economic activity on the islands was reached when President Putin visited Japan in December 2016. And since then, they've been talking about it. Subsequently, last year, they made agreement on having 5 priority projects that were going to go first. And none of these are particularly exciting for the actual substance of the project. We're talking about things like a little bit of wind energy being produced.
Fisheries.
Some aquaculture, so maybe some scallops or something like that. Some tourism, waste management, and greenhouse agriculture, maybe growing some strawberries. So these are not kind of big projects, but they are symbolically and politically very important.
Once again, baby steps.
The reason for that is because for Japan to agree to them, the condition is that they have to be done in such a way that does not damage Japan's legal position. So this is where we get really into the sort of technical legal things. So if Japan in a normal way were to invest on the islands, were to send Japanese citizens to work there,
visit the graves,
that's a separate issue. But on the economic issue, if they were to do it in normal circumstances, it would be essentially recognizing Russian sovereignty, because they would have a Russian visa, they would be paying tax to the Russian authorities, they would be subject to Russian courts. So Japan is not going to agree to that. So that's the obstacle to these joint economic activities taking place. The Japanese side wants them to be done under a special legal framework which is separate from Russian law. And so that's the absolute kind of core element to Abe's Russia visit. Can he get agreement on this legal framework?
Okay.
And so that's what he's hoping for.
So that the legal framework is not a Japan issue, that's a Russian Federation issue. That's a legal issue nationally to them with regard to perhaps the 4 islands or with regard to Japan, right?
Absolutely. It would constitute a concession by Russia on the issue of sovereignty. They would essentially be saying that these islands are different in some way from the rest of Russian territory. We're allowing Japanese to come there to kind of invest, operate in a different way. And so that's why Abe is so interested in this, because that's the first step, the baby step towards another kind of more potentially major concession. But the problem here is, are the Russians going to agree to it?
Right.
Now, you mentioned briefly this thing about grave visits, and that's a really important point, because to an extent there is a precedent for this. Because since the early 1990s, there has been an arrangement which allows Japanese citizens to go to the islands, to visit ancestral graves without traveling there on a Russian visa. So there are these special boat trips which operate every summer. There are several of them. They take former residents, their relatives, and to be honest, kind of journalists, other interested people.
It's still on now.
Oh, absolutely. It happens every summer. There is a special boat called the Eto Pirika, which operates from Nemuro Harbor in Hokkaido, and it takes these people to the islands so they can go back to their homeland, their furusato. Now, Abe has also sought to expand that by having flights to take the former residents. And the first of those took place last year, eventually occurring in September. So he'll also want that to continue. But it's much easier to have these short-term visa-free visits for a limited number of people. It's a much bigger concession to agree to this legal framework. So looking at what the Russian officials have been saying recently, it seems unlikely that Abe is going to come back from Moscow, I think, with an agreement on the legal framework.
Okay.
And so I don't think he's going to be able to come back with something that he can then sell to the Japanese public and present as a major foreign policy victory. And there are a couple of bits of evidence there. When Foreign Minister Lavrov visited Japan in March, just before arriving, he said, I don't see the need for a supranational framework, suggesting that Japanese companies should invest in special economic zones under Russian law. And more recently, Deputy Foreign Minister Morgulov also said that really we're at the very start of this process. So I think what's going to happen is more agreement about additional talks. I don't think this is going to be a breakthrough summit.
But the Prime Minister also has been very judicious in how he deals with the Russian Federation and joining initiatives by the G7, for example. So there are a lot of initiatives where the G7 is ganging up on the Russians, and Japan is saying, well, we don't want to go that far. Sometimes they reluctantly participate, but there are lots of issues. The ejection of the Russian officials, for example, or the sarin gas claim in Syria, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you've hit on an absolutely crucial issue there, that this approach, this new approach to Russia by Abe is not cost-free.
That's right.
And I think there's quite a lot of frustration within other G7 members about
like the United States.
That, well, like Britain as well,
yes,
about Japan distancing itself from the G7 position. Now, the Japanese government would absolutely say that's not the case. They would point to the fact
we are bound, we are together.
That after the annexation of Crimea, Japan joined sanctions against Russia. It was the only Asian country to do so. South Korea didn't do the same thing. So they did join them. But if you actually look at what those sanctions include, they're incredibly weak.
Right.
There were 23 Russians which were included within that list. They never announced who these individuals are.
Who they are. There are 23 of them, though.
And we know that they're not some of the most high-profile Russian officials because so many of them have visited Japan, including controversial figures like the head of the Russian armed forces, Valery Gerasimov. He visited Japan at the end of last year, as did the head of the Russian army, Salyukov, who's pictured driving around in a Japanese tank. These are sorts of things which in NATO countries, in G7 countries, are really quite kind of shocking images. You also mentioned the situation with the Skripal case.
Right.
And that was something which I think created quite a lot of frustration within the UK. So this was the incident, of course, that happened on the 4th of March when a Russian, former double agent who'd been working for British intelligence but was now in retirement in the UK, along with his daughter, was poisoned by apparently this nerve agent that had been produced by the Soviet Union.
Military grade.
So they say.
Yes.
And the British government took a very strong position. It lobbied all of its partner countries, its allies, and a very large number of them joined the UK in pointing the finger at Russia
and then ejecting a bunch of
a lot of diplomats. And
Huge.
Japan wouldn't do it. There was a phone call from the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, to Abe to try and encourage him to take a stronger stance. He wouldn't do it. Also, the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, did the same, calling Kono. Also, Japan wouldn't move. And they stuck for a very long time to this position, saying, we condemn the use of chemical weapons, we call for a full investigation, but they wouldn't take stronger action. And it was only eventually when the foreign ministers of the G7 met in Canada several weeks later that Japan, I think fearing isolation, eventually signed a joint statement saying, it looks like Russia was responsible.
Just a couple months ago, right.
But by then, they'd already signaled to the Russian side that, frankly, we're not really on board with the G7.
So the Prime Minister is kind of giving a lot in hopeful anticipation that it will be reciprocated, and it doesn't look like there's much reciprocation in the pipeline.
That's right, but it's not just about the islands. If it was just about the islands, I think you could fairly be very critical of Abe and say that this is extremely naive.
Right.
It's an obsession about these islands, but there's more to it as well.
Okay, so let's talk about China and Russia.
Exactly. So this is the strategic angle.
Right.
And if you look at East Asia, Russia is not a threat. There isn't a Russian diaspora in other countries that they might feel an obligation to protect. It's not a revisionist power. It's not trying to extend its influence. It's a status quo power.
Right.
So Japan's concern, of course, is Northeast Asia. Its concern is with China. It's with North Korea. And so from a strategic perspective, it makes a huge amount of sense to neutralize a problem with your northern neighbor. In a way, it goes back to what we were talking about in 1941.
Right.
You eliminate the problems that you can so you can concentrate better on the more pressing issues. So just recently, the Japanese government issued the Diplomatic Blue Book, this annual publication. And I looked at the section on Russia there, and it's very, very clear. It says that the relationship with Russia is Japan's bilateral relationship with the greatest potential. It goes on to say that building a relationship of appropriate ties of partnership within the region serves not only Japan's national interests, but also the cause of peace and prosperity in Northeast Asia. It couldn't be clearer. That's why they're doing it. It's not just about the islands, it's also about ensuring that Russia is not in a hostile kind of position towards Japan, does not forge a sort of common front against Japan with China.
Non-participatory.
Yeah. They don't expect, to forge an alliance, a partnership with Russia. They just need to neutralize Russia as a potential threat in the sense of it joining with China.
Right. So you're not really very positive about an outcome with the Putin-Abe meeting in 5 days' time?
No, I'm not. I mean, it's not going to be a disaster either, I think. There will be some agreements to announce. And in fact, Abe gave an interview with Russian state television. It's going to be broadcast on the eve of the visit, but some snippets of it have already been released on the internet. Mm. And in that, he emphasizes cooperation with Russia in the areas of medicine, of high technology, of kind of improving the standard of living for ordinary Russians. So I think they'll be able to make some agreements there. That will be what takes place in St. Petersburg on the first day. On the second day, I think they'll make an agreement allowing an additional flight to take place this year so that former residents who used to live on these islands and then were expelled by the Soviet Union can visit the islands this year in a special kind of charter flight.
Okay.
And I think also they'll come up with an agreement to continue talks about working out the nitty-gritty of these joint economic activities. But as I say, the major obstacle remains of that legal framework. And frankly, I don't see how they can overcome that hurdle.
Right.
Interestingly, the Russians have made a counter-proposal. A few senior Russian politicians have floated the idea of creating a visa-free zone that would apply to all of Hokkaido and to all of Sakhalin. Now, it's Sakhalin region that administers the 4 disputed islands. So this would mean that residents of Hokkaido and the Sakhalin region, including the islands, could, freely, move between Russia and Japan. There's some precedent for this. Norway and Russia have a small visa-free area. Mm-hmm. But here I think it's not the Russian side that would say no, but rather the Japanese side. I think many on the Japanese side would be worried about having such an open agreement with their northern neighbor.
But can't you imagine what a wonderful thing it would be to have cruise ships, Japanese cruise ships, or maybe even Russian cruise ships, traveling and traversing the 4 islands, because it's just gorgeous up there. It's pristine, several active volcanoes, lots of fishing going on. That would be really something.
Well, it's a great point, and it's actually something that they can potentially agree on in a few days that would be a manageable element of the joint economic projects on the islands. Because if you have these boat trips, which could circle the islands, go through the waters, but not actually, have Japanese citizens setting foot on the islands, the visa issue isn't such a problem. And that would, again, it's a small step, but it would allow Japanese citizens to get closer to this territory that they haven't controlled since 1945.
Right. President Putin and Prime Minister Abe will be meeting. They'll be discussing a lot of these issues. We're going to continue to watch it. You should too. Please stay tuned.
He who breaks the rules goes back to the house of pain.